bundle was left in the coldest hour before dawn. A tiny, silent form wrapped in a thin cloth pressed against the heavy wooden door of a church. Inside, a man named Samuel, who cleaned floors for a living, found her. He was poor, alone, and invisible. But in that moment, he made a choice that would defy every law, break every system, and decades later, shake the foundations of an empire. Because that abandoned baby girl did not just survive, she became a billionaire. And she was coming home for the man the world forgot. This is the true story of Samuel Kofi, a man who earned less in a month than the price of the baby formula he now desperately needed to buy. By every rule, he should have handed that infant to the authorities, but he looked at her and he remembered his own loneliness. So he broke the rule, he kept her, and in doing so, he ignited a forbidden question: what happens when love, not law, writes a child's future? This is how that impossible decision began, not with hope, but with sheer, terrifying need. Samuel's world was built on silence and shadows. For 15 years, his life had been measured in the scrape of a broom on stone, the smell of old wood polish, and the echoing quiet of the church after everyone left. He lived in a single room behind the sacristy, a space he kept as spotless as the altar. His pay was 40,000 cedis a month. A bag of rice cost 10,000. A single can of formula, the kind the wealthy mothers in town bought, cost 8. Every cedi was a choice between hunger and less hunger. The morning he found her, his routine shattered. He had been sweeping the front steps when he saw the cloth bundle. For a long minute, he just stared, hoping it was a mistake, a bag of rubbish. Then it moved. He knelt, his knees cracking, and pulled back the cloth. A face, impossibly small, eyes screwed shut against the cold. No note, no explanation, just a life left like an offering he never asked for. His first thought was the police. The law was clear, he had to call. Every day, over 50 Barbies are abandoned in this country. Some are left safely at hospitals under safe haven laws. Others are not so lucky. Samuel knew this. But his hand didn't reach for the church phone. Instead, it reached for her. He lifted her, and her weight, barely the weight of a prayer book, settled into the crook of his arm. She didn't cry. She was too cold, too weak. And in that silence, Samuel made his decision. He would not add her to the system's tally. He would not let her become a number in a foster care report, one of the 70,000 children waiting for a home that might never come. He called her Grace. The first night was terror. He had no bottles, no diapers, no medicine. He warmed cow's milk with water, feeding her drop by drop from a clean rag. He fashioned diapers from torn-up sheets, his large, calloused hands fumbling with the pins. She slept in a drawer he lined with his only spare sweater. Every whimper felt like a siren. The pastor lived on the grounds. The deacons could arrive at dawn. Samuel's entire existence, his job, his home, depended on invisibility. Now he was hiding a crying, living secret. But Grace didn't cry much. She was quiet, watchful. As days blurred into weeks, a new calculus defined Samuel's life. His 40,000 cedis now had to stretch to cover powdered milk, a luxury he could only afford in the smallest tins. He skipped meals, his own hunger a dull background noise to her need. He cleaned houses after his church shift, taking any extra work, any scrap of cash. He moved through the town like a ghost, Grace hidden in a sling against his chest beneath his oversized jacket. To the world, he was just a thin, tired janitor. No one looked close enough to see the bundle he carried. The fear was a constant companion, not just of being caught, but of failing. What if she got sick? Research is brutal on this point. If an institutionalized child isn't placed in a family setting within 6 months, the risk of permanent physical and cognitive delays skyrockets. Samuel didn't know the science, but he knew the look of a child who wasn't thriving. He saw it in her thin limbs, in the way she sometimes stared too quietly. He was one fever, one infection, away from a catastrophe he could not afford. He found an unlikely ally in Sister Agnes, the elderly church cook. She said nothing for a month, just watched him grow thinner, his eyes more hollow. Then one afternoon, she placed a pot of fortified porridge and a jar of homemade ointment by his door. No note, no questions asked. It was the first act of complicity, a thread of grace in the conspiracy. For a year, this was their life, a hidden, hand-to-mouth existence built on stolen moments and silent understandings. Samuel taught Grace to walk in the locked church at midnight, her tiny hands gripping his fingers as they paced between the pews. He whispered stories to her, not from the Bible, but from his own childhood memories of a mother he barely remembered. In that sacred, stolen space, she was not an abandoned child, she was his daughter. But the outside world does not stop for secret families. When Grace was nearly 2, the first crisis hit. A fever spiked in the middle of the night, burning through her small body. Samuel had no car, no money for a clinic that would ask for identification, for a birth certificate that did not exist. He held her through the dark hours, bathing her with well water, praying in a way he hadn't prayed in years. By morning, the fever broke, but the message was seared into him. His love was not enough. It was a wall against the cold, but it was not a shield against the realities of a world that required papers, money, and legitimacy. The pressure began to warp his choices. He took riskier jobs, hauling scrap metal for a man who paid in cash and asked no questions. He came home with cuts and bruises, his meager earnings clutched in his fist. Every CD was a brick in a fragile wall protecting Grace. He started to see officials everywhere, in the market, on the street. Every glance felt like an accusation. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. The church diocese announced a mandatory renovation. Workers would be coming in, turning the building inside out for 2 months. Samuel's room behind the sacristy would be a storage site for tools. He and his belongings would have to find somewhere else to go. He had nowhere to go. His entire life, his entire illegal, beautiful, precarious life with Grace was tied to that room, that church, that invisibility. The renovation was a death sentence for their hidden world. He stood in the empty nave, the notice crumpled in his hand, Grace holding onto his leg. The walls that had sheltered them were about to be torn down, and with them, the only home she had ever known. He had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to find the impossible, a new place to hide, a new way to survive, or finally face the system he had defied for so long. And that system, he knew, did not look kindly on poor, single men who claimed fatherhood over children with no legal origin. Samuel's first move was not to find a new home, but to buy time. He went to the head deacon, a man named Mr. Mensah, and with his eyes cast down in a performance of humility, he asked if he could temporarily use the old, disused gardener's shed on the far edge of the church property. It was a leaking tin roof over a dirt floor, but it was out of sight. Mr. Mensah agreed, seeing only a compliant employee making a small request. He did not see the 2-year-old girl hiding behind Samuel's legs. For 2 more months, the shed became their world. The rain drummed a constant, damp rhythm on the roof. Samuel lined the corners with chicken wire to keep out rats. At night, he told Grace stories about a magical, dry castle, and she would fall asleep to the sound of his voice, a tiny anchor in the pouring dark. But survival on the edge of a construction site was a war of attrition. The noise of hammers and saws was a constant alarm. Workers came and went. Every stranger was a potential threat. Samuel's solution was to make Grace disappear. During the day, while he worked, he would leave her in the care of Sister Agnes, who had begun to unofficially run a small, hidden daycare in her pantry for a few other children of struggling cleaning staff. It was a network of the invisible, protecting their own. Here, Grace learned her letters from worn-out flashcards and shared meager lunches with other children who understood silence. It was here that something unexpected emerged. While other children played, Grace would arrange stones into intricate patterns or trace mathematical equations in the dust that Sister Agnes, a former teacher, recognized were far beyond a toddler's grasp. She wasn't just smart. Her mind worked with a fierce, analytical precision. Sister Agnes pulled Samuel aside one evening. "This child," she whispered, tapping her own temple, "what is inside her is a fire. You cannot keep it in this shed." Her words were a blessing and a curse. Samuel had known love was not enough. Now he knew that her mind asterisk was not enough either. It needed fuel, a classroom, a chance. The local public school required a birth certificate. A private tutor cost more than his annual salary. The wall around them was no longer just physical. It was educational, legal, and closing in. His desperation crystallized into a single, dangerous goal. He needed to get Grace a legal identity. He needed, in the eyes of the state, to become her father. He walked into the district's social welfare office with a story he had rehearsed for a week. He claimed his sister had died in a distant village, leaving her daughter in his care, and all the documents were lost in a fire. The social worker, a tired woman named Alma, listened without looking up from her form. She had heard every version of this story. You need a death certificate for the mother. You need a letter from the village chief. You need proof of kinship, she recited, her voice a flat monotone. Without these, she is an abandoned child. The procedure is foster care while we investigate. Foster care, the two words were an abyss. Samuel knew the statistics. While over 46,000 children are adopted from foster care each year, nearly 70,000 more are still waiting. The average wait is over 3 years. For a bright, quiet girl like Grace, a succession of temporary beds and overwhelmed caregivers could snuff out that fire sister Agnes saw. He left the office, the bureaucratic door slammed shut in his face. The law, designed to protect, was now the greatest threat to her future. So Samuel did what the invisible do. He went underground. He found a man named Kofi who operated from a backroom photocopy shop. For 50,000 cedis, more than a month's wages, Kofi could produce a birth certificate. The name would be Grace Kofi, father Samuel Kofi. The village of birth would be one that had burned down in a flood 5 years prior, making records impossible to verify. It was a perfect, fragile fiction. The night Samuel picked up the document, holding the crisp, official-looking paper, he felt no triumph. Only a heavy, metallic fear. He had just committed a serious felony. He had traded one prison, the shed, for another, a life built on a lie that could unravel at any query from any official. But the lie worked. With the certificate, he enrolled Grace in a low-cost community school. It was a single room with 60 children, but it had a teacher. Grace's world exploded. Numbers, words, maps. She drank it all in, her quietness mistaken for shyness by others, but Samuel saw the intense focus. She would come home and teach him what she learned, her small finger tracing shapes in the dirt floor. For a fleeting year, they had a rhythm. Samuel worked 3 jobs: the church at dawn, a warehouse loading dock in the afternoon, and washing dishes at a restaurant at night. He existed on 2 hours of sleep and the sight of Grace's schoolbooks, filled with her neat, precise writing. He was burning himself down to ash to keep her flame alive. The pivot came from a direction he never expected: the school itself. A nationwide standardized test was administered to all 4th-year students. Grace, just 7 years old, scored in the 99th percentile. A letter arrived not at the shed, but at the school, addressed to the parents of Grace Kofi. It was an invitation for her to apply for a full scholarship, including boarding, at the prestigious Pan-African Academy for the Gifted, 200 miles away in the capital. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, books, uniform, even a small stipend. It was a miracle. It was a death sentence. Samuel stood in the headmaster's office, the letter trembling in his hand. The headmaster, a kind man, beamed. "This is unheard of for our school. You must be so proud. This is her chance, Mr. Kofi. This is everything." Samuel could only nod, his throat sealed shut. To say yes meant sending his 7-year-old daughter away. It meant trusting a system he didn't know to care for the center of his universe. It also meant her leaving the only home she knew, a leaking shed, and entering a world of privilege and scrutiny. What if they asked for more documents? What if they did a background check? What if they discovered the truth about the man named Kofi in the photocopy shop? But to say no, that was unthinkable. It would be to look a miracle in the face and slam the door. It would be to chain her genius to his poverty forever. Sister Agnes found him that evening, sitting silently in the dark shed, the letter in his lap. "You are thinking of the danger," she said. He nodded. "Think instead of the crime," she replied, her voice stern. "The crime would be to keep her here. That brilliant mind is not yours to bury. It belongs to the world." Filled out the application forms that night, his large hands clumsy with the pen. In the section labeled Father's Occupation, he wrote Church Custodian. He listed the church as their address. He poured every truth of his love into the essay questions about her character and every lie of their existence into the factual blanks. They were called for an interview in the capital. Samuel spent his last savings on 2 bus tickets and a second-hand dress for Grace that was too big but clean. He taught her how to shake hands, how to look adults in the eye, how to say "yes, sir" and "no, ma'am." He was preparing her to leave him. The academy was a fortress of glass and green lawns, a world of quiet efficiency and confident children. Grace, in her oversized dress, was silent and observant. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Anakai, focused entirely on Grace, asking her complex puzzles, watching her think. Samuel sat in the corner, a statue of anxiety. At the end, Dr. Anakai turned to him. "Mr. Kofi, Grace is exceptional, but our scholarship is holistic." We need to be confident in the home environment. Tell me, what do you hope for your daughter?" Samuel's voice was rough from disuse. "I hope," he began, "that she never has to be afraid of the rain." The answer was so stark, so unlike the polished speeches Dr. Anakai was used to, that she simply stared. Then she nodded once. A week later, the acceptance letter came. Grace had a full scholarship. She would leave in 1 month. The weeks were a blur of heartbreaking preparation. Samuel sold the few things he had of value to buy her a proper trunk, a small lamp, and a calculator. He sewed name tags into the uniforms the academy provided. He was building a life raft for her and pushing it out to sea. The day she left, he knelt in front of her at the bus station. "You listen to your teachers. You learn everything. You do not look back," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. She hugged him, a tight, fierce grip, and then she climbed onto the bus without crying. She didn't look back. As the bus pulled away, Samuel felt a part of his soul tear loose and drive away with it. He returned to the empty, silent shed. The war to keep her was over. He had won, and in winning, he had lost everything that gave his life meaning. For 5 years, his world shrank to the edges of a money order form. His entire existence became about earning the extra 50 CDs a month to send to her for incidentals, so she would never feel lesser among her wealthy peers. He lived on boiled yams and salt. He aged a decade in those 5 years, his body worn down by relentless labor and profound loneliness. Grace thrived. Her letters, at first simple, grew into detailed descriptions of physics experiments, coding projects, and debates. She was climbing a mountain he could not even see the peak of. He kept every letter in a biscuit tin under his bed, an archive of her escape. Then, when Grace was 12, the system he had tricked finally turned its gaze upon him. It came not from the academy, but from the city. A new digitized property tax roll was being compiled. A clerk, cross-referencing addresses, found a discrepancy. The church was listed as the address for a Grace Kofi, a minor, but no such person was registered as living at the church in the national database. A routine query was sent to the church office. Mr. Mensah, the deacon, confused, brought the letter to Samuel. "Who is this Grace Kofi at our address?" he asked, his brow furrowed. The lie, so carefully maintained for years, had finally been discovered by a bored clerk in a fluorescent-lit office hundreds of miles away. The invisible wall had a crack, and on the other side of that crack waited the full, bureaucratic weight of the state, now curious about the phantom girl and the janitor who claimed her. Samuel's mind went blank, a white static of pure terror. He looked at the deacon's confused face and the official letter in his hand. Every instinct screamed to run, to grab Grace from the academy and vanish. But Grace was 200 miles away, taking a mathematics exam. He was trapped. It must be a mistake," he stammered, the words ash in his mouth. "A clerical error." Mr. Mensah frowned, not with suspicion yet, but with bureaucratic annoyance. "Well, fix it. Talk to the city office. We cannot have these irregularities." He handed Samuel the letter as if handing him a bomb. Samuel's first, frantic move was to the backroom photocopy shop. But Kofi was gone. The shop was shuttered, a police notice about fraud investigations plastered across the door. His lifeline had evaporated. He went to the city offices, preparing to beg, but the clerk there was young and efficient. "The file has been flagged," she said, clicking her mouse. "It's with verification. If the address is false, it goes to social welfare for a home visit. Standard procedure." A home visit. They would come to the shed. They would see he had no proper home for a child. They would discover the child did not legally exist. The dominoes were lined up, and the first one had already tipped. He had one card left to play. He used the church phone to call the Pan-African Academy, asking to speak to Dr. Anakai. When she came on the line, her voice was cool, professional. He invented a story about a family land dispute affecting their official address. Could the academy, for their records, use a post office box instead? There was a long silence. Then Dr. Anakai said, "Mr. Kofi, we received a routine verification request from the Educational Board last week. We confirmed Grace's enrollment, of course, but these inquiries often come in clusters. Is everything all right at home?" The system was talking to itself, and his name was circling in the conversation. He had to warn Grace. He took a bus that night, spending his last cash, arriving at the academy gates at dawn. He looked like a ghost among the manicured lawns. When Grace saw him, her face lit up, then immediately clouded with concern. "Papa, what's wrong?" He took her to a bench and with the world crumbling, he told her a half-truth. "There is trouble with the papers from long ago," he said. "If anyone asked you about home, about where you lived, you say with your Uncle Samuel in the church house. You remember the big stone house?" "Yes." She looked at him, her 12-year-old eyes seeing right through him. "We lived in the shed, Papa," she said quietly. "Why do I have to lie?" He had no answer that wouldn't devastate her. He just gripped her hands. "Because the world is not always kind to stories like ours." The hammer fell 3 weeks later. A social worker and a polite police officer arrived at the church. They interviewed Mr. Mensah, then asked to see Samuel's living quarters. The shed, with its dirt floor and chicken wire, was not a home environment suitable for a child. The social worker, Amma, the same woman from years ago, recognized Samuel immediately. Her tired eyes turned sharp. "The man with the sister who died in a fire," she said, her voice icy. "You never came back with the documents." The investigation shifted from a tax discrepancy to a potential case of child trafficking, fraud, and illegal adoption. Samuel was detained for questioning. For 48 hours, he sat in a stark room, repeating his story until it sounded hollow even to him. They threatened him with prison. They said Grace would be placed in an emergency foster home, her scholarship revoked pending a stable placement. They used the exact language of the system he feared. They did not understand they were threatening to dismantle a universe. He broke only when they showed him a photo of Grace from her school file. "For her sake," the officer said, not unkindly, "tell us where you really got her." And so Samuel told the truth, the whole truth. The cold dawn, the cloth bundle, the fear, the love, the forged certificate. He signed a confession. He was charged with fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. He was released on bail, ordered to appear in court, and forbidden from leaving the district or contacting Grace. The news was a slow poison at the academy. First, Grace was pulled from her classes for a meeting with Dr. Anakai and a stern woman from Child Services. They told her Samuel was not her legal father, that her birth certificate was false, that she was, in the eyes of the state, an abandoned child named Baby Girl Doe. Her entire identity, her name, her family, her history, was erased in a 15-minute conversation. She was placed in the temporary guardianship of the academy, a ward of the state, her future hanging on a family court judge's decision. Samuel, now a pariah, was fired from the church. Mr. Mensah, feeling betrayed and used, wanted no part of the scandal. Sister Agnes, risking her own position, brought Samuel food and told him the little she heard. Grace was not eating. Grace was silent. Grace had stopped attending classes. The fire was guttering out. Samuel's greatest fear was manifesting not through poverty, but through the very laws he had broken to save her. But here is where the story twists. Because Grace's mind, that fierce analytical engine, did not break, it pivoted. Faced with the annihilation of her world, she did what she had been trained to do. She researched. She went to the academy library, and with a cold fury she read. She read family law. She read about safe haven statutes. She read about precedent cases of informal adoption. She learned that the state's priority was the best interest of the child, and that permanent, loving bonds were a primary factor. She learned that Samuel's confession of fraud was also a testament to 12 years of dedicated care. She saw not a dead end, but a chaotic, terrifying puzzle, and she decided to solve it. She requested a meeting with her caseworker and Dr. Anakai. She did not cry, she did not beg. She presented a case. She brought her school records, her letters from Samuel, statements from Sister Agnes about her early care. "You want to know what is in my best interest?" she said, her voice steady though her hands shook. "My best interest is the man who chose me. The system you want to place me in has 70,000 children waiting. He waited for me for 12 years. I am not a case file, I am his daughter." Audacity created a rift. The hardened caseworker saw a manipulated child. But Dr. Anakai, the educator who valued fierce minds, saw something else, a will that could not be governed by bureaucracy. She made a call. She reached out to a former classmate, a renowned family rights lawyer named Essie Coleman, and explained the impossible situation. "There's a girl here," she said, "and a father with no papers, and a state that wants to separate them. It's the most unjust math I've ever seen." Essie Coleman took the case pro bono. She visited Samuel in his new, bleak room in a poor boarding house. She saw not a criminal, but a shattered man. "The charges are serious," she told him, "but the story is your only defense. We will go to court, we will tell the judge everything, and we will petition for you to legally adopt her." Samuel looked at her hollow-eyed. "I have no money, no job, no home. They will never let me." Essie leaned forward. "They might, because you have one thing foster parents spend years trying to build: unbreakable attachment. The research is on our side. But Samuel," her voice softened, "Grace will have to testify. She will have to stand in front of a judge and claim you, knowing you are not her blood, knowing you broke the law. She is 13 years old. The pressure will be immense. Are you prepared for what that will do to her?" It was the worst possible question. To secure her future, he had to expose her to a brutal public scrutiny. To keep her, he had to risk breaking her spirit in a courtroom. The collision was no longer between Samuel and the state. It was between the love that built her and the world that would now dissect it. And Grace, armed with nothing but the truth and her formidable mind, was ready to walk into the eye of the storm. The courtroom battle would not just decide her home. It would put on trial the very idea of what makes a father. The courtroom was not grand. It was a small, wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and anxiety. Samuel wore a borrowed suit that hung loose on his gaunt frame. Grace, now 13, sat beside her lawyer, Essie Coleman, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a student waiting for an exam, not a child fighting for her family. The state's attorney painted a picture of a dangerous precedent: a forger, a liar, a man who stole a child's identity and now asked to be rewarded for it. He spoke of the rule of law, the sanctity of documents, the chaos that would ensue if every well-meaning person could simply keep a baby they found. Then Essie Coleman stood. She did not argue against the facts. She embraced them. "Your Honor, my client broke the law. He committed fraud. He did so because the alternative was to let a newborn baby enter a system where, statistically, she would have a less than 50% chance of being adopted before agging out. He saw a life, and he chose to build a world for it with his own hands, even if it meant breaking the rules of a world that had already abandoned her." She presented the evidence: Grace's stellar academic records, photographs of the clean but pathetic shed, sworn statements from Sister Agnes about the care Grace received, and the stack of money order receipts, every extra CD Samuel ever sent. Then the judge, an older woman with a tired but keen face, looked at Grace. "The child may speak." Grace stood. She was so small behind the large wooden podium. She looked at the judge, then at Samuel, then back at the judge. Her voice, when it came, was clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, they keep calling me a child, but I am a person. I have a mind and a memory and a heart. I remember the smell of polish in the church. I remember the sound of the rain on our roof. I remember my father going hungry so I could have milk. I remember him teaching me to read by candlelight. The law says I was abandoned, but I was found. The law says he is not my father, but he is the only father I have ever known. You can change the words on a paper, but you cannot change the truth in my bones. I am his daughter, and if you take me away from him, you will not be protecting me. You will be abandoning me for a second time." The room was silent. The state's attorney shifted in his seat. The judge's pen stilled. Samuel stared at his hands, tears dripping onto the scratched wood of the defendant's table. The judge's ruling took a week. It was a masterpiece of balancing law and humanity. Samuel was found guilty of the forgery charges and given a 2-year suspended sentence, conditional on good behavior and regular check-ins with a probation officer. The state, however, dropped the obstruction and trafficking charges for lack of malicious intent. Then, turning to the family court petition, the judge granted it. She cited the overwhelming evidence of a profound parent-child attachment and the exceptional circumstances of the case. She made it official. Samuel Kofi was now the legal adoptive father of Grace Kofi. The forged birth certificate was nullified, and a new legal one was issued, with Samuel listed as the father. The fiction had become fact. They left the courthouse into a blinding afternoon sun. Samuel felt weightless, unmoored. Grace simply took his hand. The war was over, they had won, but they returned to a world in ruins. Samuel had no job, no home. The church would not take him back. They lived in a single rented room, paid for by Essie Coleman's firm as a temporary charity. The victory felt hollow, edged with the panic of survival. This is where Grace's mind, now freed from the threat of separation, shifted gears entirely. She returned to the Pan-African Academy, not just as a student, but as a young woman with a mission. She saw her father's exhaustion, the way his hands shook with the fatigue of a decades-long fight. She understood that love had won the battle, but it would not pay the rent. She began to study not just for knowledge, but for application. At 14, she taught herself to code from library books. At 15, she won a national science fair with a simple algorithm that optimized bus routes for market traders, a problem she'd watched Samuel struggle with for years. The prize money, $5,000, was more money than Samuel had ever seen. She handed it to him. "For our home," she said. He refused. "This is for your future, for university." She insisted, "Our future, our university." They bought a small, clean apartment in a modest part of the capital. It was the first real home either of them had ever known. With a stable base, Grace's intellect exploded. She earned a full scholarship to MIT at 17. Samuel, terrified of her being so far away, could only bless her journey. "You are going to where the light is," he told her. "Do not look back at my shadow." At MIT, Grace Kofi became Grace Kodjo, choosing a new surname to mark their legal new beginning. She studied computer science and economics. In her second year, she identified a flaw in nascent blockchain-based supply chain software, a problem of trust and verification that reminded her of her own forged certificate. She built a solution in her dorm room. She called it Verita's Chain. By her senior year, she had venture capital funding. Within 5 years of graduation, Verita's Chain was the global standard for transparent logistics, used by governments and Fortune 500 companies. By age 28, Grace Kodjo was a billionaire. Her story, the abandoned baby turned tech prodigy, became global media fodder. But she always told the same version. "I was found by a man who had nothing, which meant he had everything to give." And then she returned, not with a quiet visit, but with a public seismic gesture. She bought the entire block containing the old church and the now derelict shed. She did not tear it down. Instead, she funded a massive restoration of the church itself, and on the exact spot of the gardener's shed, she built the Samuel Kofi Center for Early Childhood and Family Integrity. It was a state-of-the-art facility that combined a safe haven baby drop-off, a legal clinic for informal caregivers, and a preschool for gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds. The center's motto, etched in stone at the entrance, was, "Every child deserves a beginning. Every caregiver deserves support." At the grand opening, the media swarmed. Grace, elegant and poised in a tailored suit, stood at the microphone. Next to her, in a new, simple suit that fit him properly, stood Samuel, now 60, his hair white, his gentle face a map of every hard year. Grace did not speak about algorithms or market share. She spoke about the rain on a tin roof. She spoke about the cost of a can of formula. She spoke about the weight of a child in your arms and the weight of the world on your shoulders. Then she turned to Samuel. "This man," she said, her voice breaking for the first time in public, "taught me that family is not a document. It is a decision you make every single day. He decided for me, every day. Now I decide for him." She announced that she was stepping down as CEO of Verita's Chain to chair the foundation running the center full-time. The billion-dollar empire would run itself. Her life's work would be here, honoring his. The final surprise came not from Grace, but from Samuel. In his brief, shy speech, he revealed that for 20 years, every single night, he had written a one-line entry in a diary about Grace. A memory, a hope, a fear. He had filled 20 notebooks. He donated them to the center's library. The very first entry, dated the day he found her, read, "Today I was no longer just a man who cleans. I became a father. I am terrified." The last entry, from the night before the opening, read, "Today, my daughter built a palace on the spot where we once slept in the dirt. Love is the only algorithm that never fails." The story closes not with the blare of headlines, but with a quiet moment after the crowds left. Samuel and Grace sat on a bench in the center's garden, on the same axis where the shed's door once hung. He reached over and took her hand, just as he had when she was a child afraid of the rain. No words were needed. The journey from a cold church doorstep to this sunlit garden was complete. The abandoned baby had not just been saved, she had become the savior. The invisible janitor had not just raised a child, he had launched a legacy that would now protect thousands of others. Their story was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a light to be shared. And it proved one undeniable truth: the most powerful forces in the universe are not money or power, but a single choice to love and the courage to build a future on it, one impossible day at a time. So what does this story truly prove? that a billionaire came from a shack. We love that narrative, the dramatic inversion of fortune, but that is just the glittering surface. Dig deeper and you find a more radical truth. This story proves that the most essential building block of society is not law, not policy, not even blood. It is one person's stubborn, irrational, courageous decision to care for another. Samuel Kofi had no qualifications to be a father, except the only one that mattered. He was willing to be one. For every headline about a self-made billionaire, there is a quieter, untold story about the person who made that self possible. Samuel was the human substrate upon which Grace's genius grew. His poverty was the pressure that formed her diamond-hard will. His unconditional love was the psychological safety net that allowed her to leap into the unknown without fear. The system saw an infraction. Reality saw a foundation. This forces a difficult, beautiful question. How many potential Graces are out there right now, bundled in doubt or circumstance, waiting for a Samuel? How many Samuels are there, people of profound but invisible love, who simply lack the one tool or the one break to transform that love into a legacy? The Samuel Kofi Center is an attempt to bridge that gap, to provide the support so that love doesn't have to operate in the shadows, so that care doesn't have to be a crime. Their journey reframes everything we think we know about success. We chase wealth, power, influence. But Samuel, with his broom and his boundless heart, built something more permanent than any empire. He built a person. And that person, in turn, built a monument to the very love that built her. The cycle is complete. From abandonment to belonging, from lack to abundance, and finally, from receiving grace to institutionalizing it for generations to come. Which brings us to you right now listening to this. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? This story isn't just about them. It's a mirror. It asks you, in your own life, where can you be the Samuel? It doesn't require finding a baby on a doorstep. It requires noticing the person everyone else walks past. It requires the small, defiant act of choosing to see, to stop, to stay. It requires believing that your actions, however small they seem, can be the first domino in a chain reaction of transformation you may never live to see the end of. That is the final, silent lesson of Samuel and Grace. The future is not written by the powerful in boardrooms. It is written in 1,000 daily choices by ordinary people to extend a hand, to share a meal, to offer a word of belief. You have that power. Your kindness is not a small currency. It is the most potent creative force in the universe. If this story reminded you of that truth, if it made you believe again in the quiet heroes among us, then do not let this feeling fade. Share this story, talk about it, let it remind others. And if you want to join us in uncovering more narratives that reveal the incredible architecture of the human spirit, then don't forget to subscribe. Stay with us. Because the world is full of untold stories, waiting for someone like you to listen, and perhaps to be inspired to write a new chapter of your own. Thank you for watching.